I think probably like most people, one picked up the vibes around lunchtime, and certainly when actually getting a request from Stephen Swinford of the Times to write something on the basis that he wasn't quite sure at that point exactly what was going on, but felt enough that he suggested, could I find time to write something, which, because I was running around London, wasn't that easy. So in the end, just to how difficult these things can be sometimes, I spent 15 minutes sitting in Victoria railway station, where of course you've got good Wi-Fi.
Yes.
Very, very quickly wrote about 400 words on the subject.
Fantastic stuff. And there are lots of glee on social media about the actual choreography of the announcement. Rishi Sunak getting drowned with Dareem's Labour anthem, "Things Can Only Get Better," being blasted out by Steve Bray from the gates of Downing Street. And when you looked at the framing, did you think to yourself, this is a big mistake? Or do you think, oh, well, the guy's got cojones, he's going for it, even if it's a bit embarrassing?
Well, look, I've long been on the record, Henry, as saying, and I thought he was going to go on the 14th of November. So I should put my hands up first of all and say, well, that's one I got wrong. But equally, of course, that does lead me to question the wisdom of the Prime Minister's decision. I've long since taken the view that, he was probably heading for defeat at the next general election, and that therefore, from his personal point of view, the wisest course of action was to bank the 2 years he's got as prime minister, and to use it to get through what would have been his legacy, which is the legislation that might pave the way towards the end of tobacco smoking in the UK, which would be more than most prime ministers managed to achieve. But he's decided to go to the country early. Actually, prorogued at a very difficult time, because the prorogation doesn't happen to have until next Thursday, but the House is on holiday next week. So therefore, we had a particularly short wash-up period. And as a result, his tobacco legislation got washed out. Now, that's already, raises questions about, how much were they really thinking through the consequences of what they were deciding to do. And the fact that certainly nobody could find the Prime Minister an umbrella. I mean, inevitably, and I don't want to repeat Labour's campaign lines, but it's not surprising that Labour are saying, well, here's a man who's got a plan, but apparently he doesn't have an umbrella. It makes it difficult. Now, at the end of the day, I mean, these are if this matters, and this kind of thing, it will only matter because it reinforces in the mind of the electorate an impression they already have. I mean, on its own, getting rain soaked in Downing Street is not going to determine the result of the election. On the
Sure, Sir
other hand,
John, but I would say, I mean, those moments outside Downing Street with the lectern and with the famous number 10 in the black door, they don't happen very often. And so they go down in history. They have a long tail. And to
oh,
have
sure.
those words drowned out by Steve Bray and "Things Can Only Get Better," I mean, it doesn't look good, does it? And as you say, I suppose, it sums up a government really kind of running out of road.
Well, if indeed that is the electorate's perception, that this is a government's running out of road, a government whose competence they doubt, then sure, this provides a visual image that helps to reinforce that impression. But I think visual images work when they are consistent with an existing impression that people have, and then it becomes a visual image that conveys what they've already been thinking. So it's something that will help to, for some people, reinforce their view of the Prime Minister.
Okay, let's shift gear a little. Let's pivot, Sir John, and talk about you as a person. Now, what does this announcement mean for your own plans? I mean, I bumped into you once or twice. I think it was at the RSA the last time, and I was having lunch, and I said, "Sir John," and you went, "Hello," and then you got back into that laptop of yours. You never leave it. It's completely glued to you. When do you relax? When do you get a chance to breathe? I'm assuming you didn't have any plans for July the 4th. You weren't planning to go on holiday. You're probably just thinking ahead to September or November for the
Well,
election, weren't you?
Well, for reasons that are more to do with my wife's career and employment than mine, actually we booked the last weekend for 2 weeks in the second half of August. So fortunately, I'm not caught on that account. So I mean, otherwise, I, like lots of academics, have been writing pretty furiously for some weeks and months now, trying to get things out before the election. And in my case, the most recent thing is that we're working on British social attitudes, which of course is an annual national survey. We were writing with a view to getting it out at the end of June, which was, from our point of view, relatively quick. And in terms of the autumn election, one of my jobs this weekend is now to very, very rapidly finish off a couple of chapters so that we can get it out in the middle of June rather than towards the end. So that's the most immediate impact. Otherwise, yeah, I'm going to have to rejig my diary a bit.
Right, okay. As I alluded to earlier, you become a very familiar face on the broadcast media, both on radio and TV, because, of course, right now, you and I are speaking, and I can see you on Zoom, so this will be clipped, and it's going to be pushed out on social media, and you're going to become even more recognizable. Do you like the fame, or do you think, oh, I'm an academic, please, I'm not a celebrity?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of me that feels like that. I mean, I certainly, when I occasionally read reports in the newspapers saying John Curtice says blah, 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 and apparently the fact that I've said it means it has some peculiar resonance or predictive power, I go, this is nonsense.
Well, what's it like being recognized, getting stopped in the street? I'm sure that happens quite a bit. I mean, lots of people were looking at you at the
No, look,
RSA, and they were thinking, is that him?
I mean, most people are perfectly nice and are extremely grateful for willing to do it. Of course, these days it is indeed, it's a selfie rather than being asked to sign something, which in a sense is rather easier.
Yes.
I live with it, Henry.
All right.
There's no point in being impolite to people if they do want to come. And to be honest, most people, if they come up to you, say, we think what you're doing is good, or we enjoy what we do, whatever. Doubtless the many thousands of people who take the different view just don't bother to stop me.
Yeah, and what's a Curtis kind of selfie and like? I mean, yeah. But something that I want to ask you, okay, is what first turned you on to politics? Because I think you grew up in the West Country, didn't you?
I did. I was born and brought up in Cornwall. Short answer, don't know, Henry. All I can tell you is that my first memory is the death of Hugh Gaitskell in 1963 and following the subsequent Labour leadership contest that Howard Wilson, of course, won. I then remember the 1964 election where, of course, the polls closed at 9 o'clock rather than 10 o'clock and being allowed by my parents at least to watch the first hour or so of election night television, but don't ask me where the original spark came from.
Ah, okay, but it's a spark that burnt long and indeed furiously. Let's talk about some substance again, because
Sure.
there are some quite important ways that this election will be different from the last one. Let's talk about boundary changes and voter ID as well, because some activists and campaigners were very concerned about the impact it might have on the recently concluded local elections. Given what happened there, what do you think could happen at this more substantial election?
Well, let's take the boundary review first. The boundary review is not particularly important. It is true that if you take the electoral geography bequeathed by 2019, it makes Labour's job of winning an overall majority, which is already a very, very difficult one on the 2019 electoral geography, requiring about a 12% lead. It increases that figure to between about 13 and 14%. But it's less dramatic than some previous boundary reviews basically for two reasons. One is that in recent years, some of the more traditional patterns of population movement in the UK, which tended to be out of inner cities, which are kind of Labour constituencies, into suburban and rural Britain, which is more conservative. That pattern to some degree has been reversed. London in particular has been gaining population. It actually gains a parliamentary constituency to this boundary review. And London, of course, has now become a very predominantly a Labour city. Secondly, when the Conservatives won a number of red wall seats, so-called, they tended to be electorates with relatively small constituencies. And as a result, some of these constituencies have been gobbled up, enlarged, or disappeared. In Northwest Durham, for example, the seat of the Tory party chairman, Richard Holden, is divided four ways. And that's also meant, by the way, that the one big effect, which is the reduction in seats in Wales from 40 to 32, is probably also going to affect the Conservatives more than Labour, because the Conservative seats that they won in North East Wales last time are particularly marginal. So that's not proven to be as big a deal as actually it would have been if the boundary review had gone through originally as it should have done before the 2015 election.
Yeah.
On
Sorry,
vote,
before you continue, you do wonder
yeah.
whether it might help or hinder smaller parties. The Greens, well, Brighton Pavilion, they had for quite some time with Sarah Lucas. She's stepping down, and then you've got Bristol Central, Carla Denyer standing for the Greens there. Might this boundary change help her?
Well, certainly Bristol Central in the local elections, the Greens were well ahead. And they, of course, are now by far and away the largest party on Bristol Council. But of course, in a sense, that's just that the boundary view has perhaps helped them to carve out a bit of Bristol where they're particularly strong. Of course, the problem in Brighton is A, Caroline Lucas is standing down, and B, the local government backdrop for the Greens is not so propitious because having had some responsibility for running Brighton Council, that has sometimes proven to be somewhat politically costly for them. The Liberal Democrats, boundary reviews are never a good idea because they're very, very dependent on their MP's personal vote in their particular constituencies. The boundary review in theory will reduce the number of Liberal Democrat seats, but usually what happens is that where we've got a local MP who's found their constituencies moved a bit, they work very hard in the bit that's new to their constituency and perhaps in the end hang on. So, but yeah, it's more difficult for the Democrats because they're very dependent on particularly isolated pockets. On voter ID, well, this has become a subject of some partisan dispute. And the truth is, at the end of the day, because ultimately it's impossible to prove or disprove how much impact it's had, that therefore does mean that it's capable of being an area where people can follow their preconceptions rather than necessarily find the debate determined by evidence. Now, the Electoral Commission in last year's local elections did get a record of the number of people who went into a polling station and who then did not have the relevant voter ID and who did not subsequently return to vote. If I remember rightly, that was about 0.2% of the electorate. And therefore, as a result, you can argue that perhaps it didn't make much difference. On the other hand, others argue that, but hang on, people were also standing outside the polling stations saying, have you got your voter ID? And that then those people therefore weren't necessarily counted by the Electoral Commission if they didn't come back. And then others say, oh, hang on, the problem is that because people knew there was going to be voter ID and they didn't have it, they didn't bother to go to the polling station in the first place. All one can say is that last year turnout was down, a couple of points on what it was the previous year. This year, it's pretty much the same as to what it was last year. It's very, very difficult to prove what impact it has had. I mean, I think the unfortunate thing about voter ID is that the way in which it's been introduced is that it seemed to make it easier for older people to meet the voter ID requirements than it was for younger people, essentially because younger people's travel passes didn't count. On the other hand, I think one of the things we also have to remember is that older people are less likely to have a passport because they're less likely now to travel, and they may not just have bothered to renew their last passport.
Yeah,
So
could be, John. Final thoughts, Sir John. What are you looking forward to most during the next 5.5 weeks, in a nutshell?
Well, I guess probably the biggest political theory might be the leaders' debates if they take place, but the history of leaders' debates is of constant calls by whichever party is behind, which in this case is the Conservatives, and often a lot of swerving and manoeuvring by the party that's ahead to try to avoid them. Well, we'll wait and see what happens this time. Seems perhaps a fair chance they might happen. There'll only be a couple of them. That will provide us with some theatre.
Right. Do they actually move the dial, though, John? So, John, do they actually move the dial, though? To what extent?
Well, in 2010, they did. Remember those, particularly that first debate in which Nick Clegg, the Liberal Democrat leader, did particularly well. Although, in fact, by the end of the campaign, all of that Liberal Democrat rise had disappeared. But it certainly affected the rhythm of that campaign. But they don't necessarily, to be really boring, Henry. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Sometimes they do. All right. Professor Sir John Curtice, have a great weekend if you have any time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.